Welcome to the University of Uppsala, Sweden, where we are pleased to be hosting the international research project Aesthetic Cognitivism and the Prospects of Criticism. The project was conducted in collaboration with the University of Louisville, Kentucky, and is funded by the Templeton Religion Trust as part of their Art Seeking Understanding program. We are joined for today's seminar by Peter Lamarque, Professor Emeritus at the University of York, to discuss the grounds for skepticism in relation to aesthetic cognitivism. It is a mistake, Professor Lamarque argues, to attempt to understand the benefits of artistic experience in terms of knowledge, understood here as justified true belief, or to evaluate works of art in terms of their truth value or moral benefit.
Good. Welcome everybody to this afternoon's seminar for the Aesthetic Cognitivism and Prospects of Art Criticism seminar. We're delighted this week to be able to welcome our guest, Peter Lamarque, who is of course very well known to all of us, professor at the University of York for more than 20 years, and author and editor of numerous books. I think I counted 10 books, in fact, mostly on the philosophy of fiction, narrative, philosophy of literature, but also many other topics, or addressing many other topics in the philosophy of art and aesthetics. We're delighted to have you here, Peter. We're going to have our usual kind of format, presentation for about 20-25 minutes, which should leave us with just over half an hour for discussion. And just for those of you joining us now, again, a very warm welcome to all our participants. But with that, I think I'll pass the word to our speaker today, Peter Lamarque.
I'm extremely grateful to Elizabeth, Guy and John for inviting me to give this talk, particularly given that they know what I'm likely to say and are unlikely to agree with it. But in fact, I do wonder how much of an outsider I really am in relation to their project. I jotted down some remarks that John Gibson made in the introductory seminar, raising my hopes for an entente cordiale. What he said was that the project has little to do with, in his words, demonstrating that artworks are a vehicle for justified true beliefs. Truth, he insisted, had little to do with it, and he even suggested that knowledge didn't seem that important either, although he was less certain about that. The truth bit does strike me as right, as does John's promotion of artistic aboutness over semantic meaning in this context. Also, I was heartened by something that Guy and Elizabeth say in a recent paper, that the question, what exactly have you learned from a particular work of literature, is in many contexts both unanswerable and inappropriate. So I'll come back to learning and aboutness in a minute. Well, what does make me a skeptic about cognitive values in the arts? I'm going to restrict my discussion to works of literature. First of all, a point I make over and over, it's obvious enough that we can learn things from reading novels and poems, all the usual stuff about authors and styles and genres, as well as places, people, customs, fashions, modes of travel, and bits of know-how, how to rob a bank, how to escape a fire. There's plenty of cognitive advance there, with the usual caveats, of course, about reliability, authority, and artistic license. But I don't think that's at the heart of the cognitivist case. What might be called higher forms of knowledge are at stake. So let me get some personal things off my chest. One thing I truly dislike, in literature in particular, but other art forms too, is didacticism. I recoil when I get a sense that the author wants to educate me on some moral, political, social, or cultural issue. I don't like art that overtly campaigns for a cause, a kind of propaganda, nor one that seeks to manipulate my emotions. It irritates me and distracts me, usually occluding any other facets that might be of literary or artistic interest. I think this is not just a personal taste. I think it's wrong in principle to suppose that the highest calling of art and literature is to make people better citizens, more moral, more knowledgeable, more wise, more empathetic. For one thing, there's no good empirical evidence that it works, or ever has worked, that people immersed in canonical literature or the high arts are somehow more exemplary in those virtues. And if it doesn't work in practice and never has, it seems futile to keep wishing that it did. Better, I think, to look elsewhere for the values of literature. Well, that's why I prefer to subscribe to the Oscar Wildean view that we shouldn't demand, as Plato did and many demagogues still do, that art must prove itself useful, morally or socially, if it's to be justifiable and defensible, with the implication, in Plato at least, that if it fails to be useful, it should be banned. It's liberating to agree with Wilde and think of art as useless in the benign and positive sense of being removed from utilitarian and instrumental values, indeed blessed with a higher and purer calling. Incidentally, that doesn't make me a formalist any more than I think Wilde himself was. At least Wilde wasn't only a formalist, or only half a formalist. He says this: the moral life of man forms part of the subject matter of the artist, but the morality of art consists in the perfect use of an imperfect medium. Of course, works of art have content. They have a subject matter. They're about something. But I believe that in the literary arts, the content is given opaquely, not transparently, in the sense that it is partially constituted by the very forms of its presentation. So maybe like Wilde, I'm a bit of a formalist, although I think not a total formalist. Well, let me inch towards a defence of this view, the uselessness of art, in its benign sense. The first step is to stop thinking that the highest aspiration of art is truth, or the advancement of knowledge. That immediately puts art in the same box as science, where it inevitably performs badly. I'm a thought theorist, as dubbed by Noel Carroll, referring to an essay I published over 40 years ago. In that essay, I defended the view that we can have genuine emotional responses to works of fiction, even while knowing they are fiction. The central idea was that in engaging with fiction, we formed thoughts in our minds, including images, ideas, concepts, even propositions, arising from the content, and it's these thoughts that trigger emotional responses. But the thoughts are not beliefs. They're simply ideas that we entertain. We don't need to believe that what we read is literally true. Bringing thoughts to mind does not presuppose that. It's the vividness of the thoughts that is sufficient to stir our emotions. Well, since then, I've applied thought theory to the question of cognitive values in literature. The interest we have in fictional literature, I think, lies in the thoughts we accumulate in reflecting on the content. These thoughts are not beliefs or truths or items of knowledge, but they can have a powerful effect on us, not just emotionally, but by being lodged in the mind to become part of a wider intellectual and imaginative reservoir to be called on as the occasion arises. Well, here's how I describe the situation in my book, The Opacity of Narrative, published in 2014. The building up of thought clusters of the kind that, according to thought theory, elicit emotional responses can reconfigure our minds, usually, although not inevitably, in positive ways. Novels, we say, leave their mark on us. The great ones stay with us forever. This is what makes the experience of reading a novel valuable, and valuable for its own sake. What we go on to do with the thoughts thus accumulated is another matter altogether. They might affect our subsequent actions and attitudes. They might reorder our conception of ourselves. They might have no practical effect whatsoever. But any effects they do have will be contingent and largely dependent on local psychological dispositions of individual readers. That's what I said 10 years ago. Well, that surely is some kind of cognitive account of literature. but it makes no mention of either truth or knowledge. And I don't think it's a million miles away from what Guy and Elizabeth call their cumulative model of cognitive values in art, where the focus is less on what can be extracted from each particular work, rather what kinds of knowledge can be accumulated over extended exposure to art in different contexts. They write, "The knowledge we gain from our artistic encounters can become part of the resources we use to understand the world and our place in it, and serve as part of the toolbox with which to negotiate our actions and reactions." They also say, "The epistemic gain cannot always be meaningfully disentangled or isolated from other contexts which have shaped or otherwise contributed to the accumulation of relevant knowledge. And all this will depend, in their words, on the effort and disposition of the individual to incorporate what is available through the artwork into the way they understand and act within the world." Well, there's much that I agree with there, certainly, although I'm less inclined to think of the epistemic gain exclusively in terms of knowledge, which of course is not a requirement for the thought theorist. And I suspect that the overall picture, where the gains, in their words, are not meaningfully disentangled or isolated from other contexts, might make the cognitive benefits of art and literature too diffuse to capture the more specific values of individual works. Indeed, when Guy and Elizabeth do focus down on the specifics of individual works, they again return to truth and knowledge, which I think also is inclined to confuse the picture. So let's go back to Guy and Elizabeth's claim, which I entirely endorse, that the question, what exactly have you learned from a particular work of literature, is in many contexts unanswerable and inappropriate. Their argument rests on a contrast between what we might learn from specific aspects of a novel and what we might learn from the novel as a whole. Here's their example, and I quote, "When asked what did you learn about love from Anna Karenina, we can formulate an answer such as, say, that love without propriety is tragic, but still preferable to propriety without love. But when we ask," I quote from them again, "what did we learn from Anna Karenina as a whole, the interpretive constraints that hitherto framed and guided our responses start to disintegrate, and the clearly formulated and articulated propositions capable of capturing the knowledge begin to fail us." Well, it's precisely the clearly formulated proposition that interests me. The example certainly has a pleasing ring to it, but I think it's puzzling nonetheless. To say that we have learned that love without propriety is tragic, but still preferable to propriety without love, is to imply that that is true. But with interpretative generalizations of this kind, to establish their truth, we must always ask if this is inward-facing or outward-facing as a generalization. As an inward-facing generalization, it's a claim about the work itself, implicitly prefaced with an operator such as, according to the novel. So we read it as saying, according to the novel, love without propriety is tragic, and so on. Any support for that claim must adduce evidence from the novel. Do the particulars of the novel support it? And does it perhaps help shed light on the moral trajectory of the novel? Well, let's grant that it is true as a claim about the novel. That has no implications for its truth as an outward-facing generalization, as a claim about the world at large. Being true about the novel does not make it true. Quite different kinds of evidence would be needed to establish the latter. Well, let me grant that Guy and Elizabeth have identified in a pithy way one of the themes in the novel, but personally it strikes me as a dubious claim about the world at large. The idea that a relationship as tragic and destructive as that between Anna and Vronsky is better in effect than no relationship at all is at least not obviously true, not something we can confidently lodge in our knowledge bank. After all, what is the standard of preferability? But as a thought to be mulled over, like the opening lines about happy and unhappy families, it is indeed worth pondering in the style of a witty Wildean aphorism. but I think it remains some way short of knowledge. Something interesting is going on, but in this stark form, its truth is not compelling. In fact, Guy and Elizabeth offer a closely related example which nicely sidesteps the truth issue. They write, quote, "When asked what did you learn from the character of Anna Karenina, we can reply that we learnt about the strict regulation of female propriety in polite society." Note that the structure of the answer to this question is quite different from the structure of the answer to the first question. The second case is an aboutness claim with no proposition offered for truth assessment. It identifies an idea, the strict regulation of female propriety, not a proposition. We might say that's a theme or issue under consideration in the novel, or a thought that the novel brings to mind. Of course, evidence would be needed for that, but it's not making any claim to truth, and in its present form, it is not something that could be learned. No doubt, of course, we could formulate a proposition from it. Female propriety in polite society is strictly regulated. That looks like a factual claim, but I suspect too vague to be readily verified. Which polite society? That of the novel? Somewhere in the world at large? What kind of regulation? Legal, social, etiquette? Is it a moral claim, a prescription for polite societies, or perhaps a statement about a kind of oppression? Themes are very often identified in novels, not in propositions, as in the first case, but with noun phrases, as in the second. The non-propositional aboutness claims of the latter kind are in fact far the most common in critical discourse, and also more congenial to thought theory than to truth-based cognitivism. And I wonder if this is behind John's reluctance, that I mentioned at the beginning, to talk about truth in his version of cognitivism, and his inclination to stress aboutness instead, an emphasis I entirely support. So let's reflect for a minute on aboutness in this context. Let me change the example to make the points a bit sharper. Suppose we ask, what is Ernest Hemingway's novel, The Sun Also Rises, about? There are two different kinds of answers we might give. One kind, which I will call subject aboutness, says that the novel is about an ill-assorted group of aspiring writers, American and British, variously scarred by the First World War, living in Paris in the early 1920s, hard drinking, partying, cafe and nightclub frequenting, entering unstable sexual relationships, and then decamping to Spain to attend the fiesta in Pamplona with its bull running and bullfights. In that new Spanish context, the relationships begin to disintegrate, with jealousy and even violence badly souring the atmosphere. Eventually, the group disperses in various states of bitterness and disillusion. Well, at a story level, that is what the novel is about, and at that level there might be some cognitive gain for the reader. Learning about cafe society in Paris in the 1920s among a wealthy expat elite, also about bullfighting in that period, both its techniques and its rituals. But the second kind of answer to the what is it about question, which I call thematic aboutness, is very different, closely related, I think, to John's notion of artistic aboutness. Numerous analyses have been offered on the themes of the novel. There's no need to go into much detail. A good place to start might be Hemingway's own explanation of the title in epigraph to the novel from Ecclesiastes, which says this: "One generation passeth away, and another generation cometh, but the earth abideth forever. The sun also ariseth, and the sun goeth down, and hasteth to his place where he arose." Well, Hemingway's novel, contemporaneous with Proust's À la recherche du temps perdu and Joyce's Ulysses, is like them, about time passing and change and continuity, also about love and jealousy and despair, perhaps disorientation. It's sometimes said also to be about masculinity, emphasizing the heroics of the matadors. But remember that the hero of the novel, Jake, is sexually impotent after a wartime injury and is unable to consummate his relationship with Brett Ashley, the English female protagonist. Impotence of different kinds is itself also a motif. It's often supposed in discussions of cognitive values in literature that the cognitive gains will lie at a thematic level rather than a subject level. But that doesn't seem right in this or other examples. Even granted Guy and Elizabeth's warnings against asking what we learn from a particular novel, when we drill down at a thematic level, in this case centred on aboutness, time, love, jealousy, disorientation, it's hard to find in Hemingway's novel anything to take away that might count as a cognitive gain or something we've learned from its themes, adding to our stock of knowledge. Well, my suggestion is that that's simply not the role of a literary theme. A theme is not a takeaway item of knowledge or truth, but an organising principle that helps locate a further kind of interest or coherence in the particulars or subject of a work. Literary interpretation is not primarily about meaning, but about value. If we reflect on the particulars of the subject, the story told, through the lens of the thematic concepts, like those mentioned, we start to make connections. The flighty Brett Ashley claims to be in love with both Jake and Romero, the young heroic matador. Readers know that both relationships are doomed, hopeless for different reasons, but they also know that there is much more substance to the relationship with Jake. That's what makes the novel a tragedy rather than just a soap opera. The themes here and the interpretative truths implied are inward-facing, telling us about the characters, not outward-facing reflections on the world at large. Well, here finally are my brief summary conclusions, mostly actually in the form of recommendations. Don't expect novels to make you more knowledgeable, more wise, more moral, or more empathetic. Immerse yourself in novels for their own sake as works of art. Expect, at least hope, to be stimulated in mind or emotion, to have your imagination stretched, to be filled with thoughts, images or ideas or perspectives worthy to be stored away and recalled when needed, just like other memories or experiences. Don't demand that you be given truths that you can jot down in a commonplace book. Don't insist that you come away with new knowledge, except perhaps at the subject level. Don't ask what you have learned when you've finished a novel. Ask, if you must, what pleasure you have derived from it, which need not be merely ephemeral or visceral pleasures, but might be pleasures of the intellect and imagination, if that seems fitting. Ask, of course, if the novel is any good, but don't ask if it's good for you. Above all, never expect or hope that it will make you a better person. It almost certainly will not. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. Who would like to begin by asking a question? Sachi, was that a question?
Yeah, that was an attempt. That was an attempt. So thanks for this rich criticism. So I have many points and ways of challenging various things that you said, but I want to ask something more general about this, because I suppose I'm not the only one who's grew up and familiarized and grew up into this field by reading your 1983 book with Austen. And I was wondering what changed for you, because in the past decades, people have responded to this criticism. Things that you've been saying now. So, for example, John was making this distinction between cognitive value and knowledge, that it's not really knowledge, but it is cognitive growth. We grow through literature. We don't necessarily have to anchor that in truth, or there is a distinction between moral betterment and moral growth. Again, For example, being aware of more voices, witnessing some catastrophes, hearing some unheard voices from the past as a way of making us grow morally in terms of comprehension, but not necessarily better human beings. So that's a distinction that has been introduced. Your former student, Rafe McGregor, wrote about lucid phenomenological knowledge, for example, experiential knowledge, which is not precisely the same as justified truth belief, but having some claims, say about love or friendship or loss or intimacy, being anchored in a different way experientially, rather than what we had before by immersing in a fictional world. So that happens without necessarily having more justified true beliefs. So all kinds of claims have been introduced, and I was wondering whether any of that material has actually impacted your thinking or how your criticism has responded to these claims that have been published in the past decades.
Oh, well, thanks.
And it's always a pleasure hearing you, and your criticism is sharp, etc.
Well, you're very kind, Jack. You're probably nailing me here. One of the things I have been emphasizing, I think consistently since the 1990s, is the idea of experience being a response to literature. So that I don't think is a change. And you talk about experiential knowledge. I always wonder why knowledge keeps coming up. I mean, what's wrong with just having an experience that's valuable in some way? Why does it have to enhance our knowledge? I mean, the stuff that I was saying about thoughts being lodged in the mind, I mean, they are often like the thoughts we have from experiences we have. I mean, maybe reading a novel is like going on a holiday overseas. You have a wealth of experiences and they get lodged in the mind. Some of them are images, some of them are, things people said, some of them are impressions you got, whatever it is. This is an accumulation of experience. Now, I mean, maybe it's, that is enhancing our knowledge in some way. I mean, I think that, learning the names of places, which I always forget, I forget what the name of the museum is that I enjoyed, what the titles of the pictures that I saw and so on. So I lose all of that, but I do retain, a sense that I went to a museum and saw some wonderful works and so on, so on and so on. So maybe the knowledge, what I'm worried is that the knowledge bit is the stuff that in my own experience, I actually forget, because that's like the subject matter. I never remember the names of characters or the specific details of a book. But I come away from a novel or from an overseas holiday, I think, with an enriched experience. It's something I've enjoyed going through, and something which I say is lodged in the mind that you can call on when the need arises, that when something similar happens, it triggers a thought and you make an association of ideas. And this is all absolutely familiar stuff. Maybe it's just semantics, that why this has to be triggered to be related to either truth or knowledge, I'm not sure. I'm not sure what that adds to it, as it were. So experience is very important for me as part of what makes the reading of literature important, the kinds of experiences that we have, and they're the ones that I say get firmly lodged in the mind. But I know, when Guy and Elizabeth talk about something similar, they say what's lodged there is knowledge. And maybe the difference is not all that great, and partly because I suppose I think of knowledge primarily as propositional in some way. It's a knowledge of facts, or it can be expressed in knowledge. Of course, there is such a know-how, but that's a different thing as well. That's a certain skill, and I can think that you can certainly acquire know-how from novels. And maybe that's a kind of knowledge as well. Maybe I'm just being obtuse here, but But to call it knowledge or to appeal to truth seems to put it in the wrong kind of category. It's basically, I think, in the category of science. And I don't think that's where it belongs. I want to lodge it in the category of imagination or thought or imagery or whatever it is. That's where art belongs, I think. I don't see why it has to belong in knowledge. But I'm really just
Well, I'm just going to jump in. I'm glad we basically, honed in immediately to the crux of the possible disagreement here. But I'm going to pass the word to Karen. I've got a sense that you're going to follow up on this question in some way.
Yes, I am. Thank you so much, Peter. I find thinking through the agreement, disagreement really, really instructive. And I have two questions about it. And the first is just exactly about the issue that you just raised. I mean, I was just wondering if part of the disagreement does not concern the relevant conception of knowledge. And it does seem to me that part of your resistance is grounded in a particular conception of knowledge. You called it propositional knowledge now. You seem to think that knowledge is understood in terms of true justified belief. And one way to understand, a certain cognitivist, at least, this of the recent ways through which Elizabeth, John, and Guy have been thinking about a project is as suggesting that art exactly sort of challenges us to think about knowledge in other ways, that we don't need to give up the label knowledge and cognition, but we also don't need to think that the kind of knowledge that that we often gain by engaging with art is just the same kind of knowledge that we gain from science, but it is imaginative or experiential or different kind of knowledge. And in a way, it just pushes us to rethink knowledge rather than to insist that it doesn't give us knowledge. So that was one question, and I wonder if you think that that's part of the disagreement, and just because it seemed to me that you suggested so in what you said, and it seems to me that the deeper disagreement has to do with what you said in closing, the distinction between a value for and a value period, or value simplicator, and not final value. And that, I think, where I see the difference. And I'm with you. It seems to me that thinking about the value of art as reduced to a different kind of value that we are already familiar with, or as value insofar as it benefits us in particular ways, is the wrong way of thinking about it. But I wonder if you think that that way of thinking about art's value is also compatible with saying that it does benefit us in all kinds of ways. That's not what makes it valuable as it is, but it is partly because art valuable in the specific way that it is, that it also benefits us. I think this is true about virtue, ethical virtue. Ethical virtue is not good by virtue of anything else. It's good for its own sake. It's not good because it benefits us. But being good in the way that it is, it also benefits us. It's also a way of, living a better life. So I wonder about whether you see the disagreement and agreement as concerning these different conceptions of knowledge and this different distinction between a value for and value implicator.
Well, thanks very much for both questions, and they're very deep and difficult ones. I mean, I've banged my head against this for so many years. What is meant by truth in relation to art? It's sort of an old one, and of course, lots of different conceptions come out. I mean, maybe. Greg Curry in his recent book, where he's doing these things, he says in a much more forthright way than I would want to, that if you're interested in knowledge, science is your bedrock. So if you don't like that, create another concept, but don't call it knowledge. And it's the same with truth. I mean, when Stein Olsen and I were writing about truth all those years ago, I mean, we did look at different ways that people talked about truth in relation to literature, and and we make the point, I think, there, and I've made it so many times since, that if you think of truth, for example, as something like sincerity or authenticity, then that changes the terms of the debate. I think that there's a lot to be said for sincerity and authenticity in writing and so on. So then there isn't a disagreement. But some people then want to call it truth. I don't know. So you see, you sort of go round and round in circles there. That it turns out that some people who want to talk about truth and knowledge in relation to art don't have the standard paradigms, which I think are the scientific paradigm. I mean, I disagree with Greg on many things, but he's saying, that's the benchmark of knowledge. That's what makes us, as it were, a knowledge-based culture. It has been for 2,000 years. It's the pursuit of knowledge, and it's the pursuit, if you like, of justified true beliefs. But if you're not happy with that, but want some other conception of knowledge or conception of truth, say what it is, and then we'll see if there's a disagreement. And I'm very amenable to that. I mean, I've been writing recently some stuff about poetry, and what poetic truth might mean. And I'm quite sort of against myself actually thinking of poetic truth as something totally different from standard truth, but still worthy to be called truth in some way. Something like, well, I won't go into that now, but I mean, as for your second question, which is a sort of question about the intrinsic and the instrumental. And of course, there's something that's valued for itself, and you value it in itself, which is a kind of aspiration for say works of art, but perhaps other things as well. Could will be a value for you. In other words, it's some sort of gain for you. But I mean, my rather provocative conclusions there said, if you think you're going to be made better in some way by works of art, I think you might be disillusioned by that. I don't think artworks, even if you value them, valuing them for their own sake, makes you somehow more virtuous or more sympathetic or whatever it happens to be. I don't see why valuing something for its own sake actually produces a value for you as a person. I haven't articulated that right because I haven't been engaged in this debate for so long. But I think there is a difference between valuing something for its own sake and valuing it for what it can do for you, your own betterment in some way.
That is a very important distinction. Thank you both for discussing that. I'm going to pass the word to Guy with another question.
Thanks very much, Peter.
Hi.
Yes, I'm very worried about what Elizabeth and I wrote about the propriety and the tragedy of Anna Karenina, and I'm wondering about that. But in terms of the kind of like the structure of the objection, that it may well, or the proposition that we put may well be true of the novel, but that's no grounds for believing it to be true of the world. Absolutely. But I think that as a kind of like standard objection to the idea that the things that we find in literature or indeed any other art form, that the work itself does not provide the grounds or the evidence for accepting it as a truth valuable claim, are often overstated, in contrast, for example, with other kinds of non-fiction sources, for example, where we accept that there is evidence adduced. But very often, there are very few disciplines in which the evidence for a particular claim is simply part of the text or the book or the form itself, the work itself. It usually takes the form of like references to external sources or to experiments that have been undertaken. So the reference is also always outside the work and can be kind of compared with real life experience or comparing with other things, so you can make your own judgment about its kind of truth or valuability on a variety of grounds. So I think that's also something we could choose to do with the propositions that we find formulated in fictional contexts. It's just that we are not often in the business of doing that because, as you say, we're more interested in thinking about them as themes. Which leads to my second related question, which is that you said themes aren't objects of knowledge so much as organizational principles. And it struck me that a good way of describing what concepts are, or the things that are marshaled in propositions often, are themselves organizational principles, in the sense they're things that impose unity on a perceptual field or an imaginative field, and allow us cognitive access to it. And if we were to exclude something like an organizational principle from the tools and elements which make up our idea of what knowledge is, then we get a much poorer sense of what knowledge actually amounts to. So I'll leave it there. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Guy, very much. Yes, I mean, the Anna Karenina example, I mean, in the novel, Anna Karenina's downfall is breaching the conventions of propriety in upper aristocratic classes in 19th century Russia, which were very strict. She was in an adulterous relationship, and that turned out to be disastrous for her because she was completely ostracized. But so a generalization about propriety in polite society, I mean, I'd like to think that, you know, even Britain in the 21st century is to a large extent a polite society, but actually being in an adulterous relationship does not bring about your downfall, as it were. I mean, you can, you know, there are some contexts where it could be embarrassing or whatever it is. So there's something about your propriety claim, apropos Anna Karenina, is that it seems to me it has to be grounded in the conditions of her life as depicted in the novel. That's why I say it could be true of the novel that you know that brings about her downfalls, a lack of propriety in the relationship. But you want that somehow to spread wider, and I'm just not sure that it does. I mean, it spreads to other sorts of very strict societies. You know, I'm sure, you know, if it spread to the Taliban or something, being in an adulterous relationship could be fatal for you. So you know, there was a lot of different cases, but it looked like a bold claim that, you know, which I think was very nicely framed for the novel. But actually, when I call it facing outwards, it didn't seem to stand the sort of tests of which facing outwards would require to make it a true generalization. But I agree. You know, you don't always have to test these claims, and some things can be so powerfully expressed, maybe in a novel, that they convert. I can't think of a clear example now, but they can convert really quite easily to a wider world, that you can see it's so compelling as told in the novel. The circumstances that it converts easily into, you know, comparable situations outside the novel. But I'm just not sure Anna's predicament does quite convert that easily into a kind of universal context. I mean, I may be wrong, but I don't know. I mean, you know, but I think one could think of examples, just as you say, where all the evidence you need for it to be a universal truth can be found in the circumstances of the novel, in which case there's not a big distinction from being true of the novel and being true of the world. But I just thought in that case, there is a distinction there. And sorry, what was your other point? Was all concepts, and I like the way you put it, and I agree with the point that all concepts are like organizing principles. But that doesn't alter the claim I'm making that concepts which we call thematic concepts have quite a specific role in our understanding and appreciation of a literary work. We identify certain key concepts, which are, well, you know, might be love, it might be jealousy, it might be despair, whatever it is. We identify those as key concepts which organize and bring sense to and make connections within a work of art. And that's not to deny that concepts in general, the concept of love is an organizing principle because it's got so many different kinds of instantiation, and to some extent it organizes them by applying a single concept. But I think there's a specific role for thematic concepts, which I think is a kind of organization, a kind of almost like a, you know, perceptual organization, that these concepts, these thematic concepts bring to an appreciation of a work of literature, or it might be other kinds of art forms, like paintings and so on. So it's not, you don't have to choose one or the other. I agree with you about the role that concepts play in general, but I think there's a specific role that I was identifying for concepts within works of literature.
Thanks so much.
Good. Thank you both. And we're slightly over time, but we're going to take one more question. John.
I'll be really brief. Peter, that was wonderful. It's always frustrating to hear your arguments because I think most of us agree with virtually everything you say.
Oh, no.
Acknowledge a lot of that. It's just you frown at the end of it. And the rest of us seem to think there's some possibilities for cognitivism. But it's a challenge to figure out where exactly the disagreement is, except taking seriously the sort of urge to be moderate in the lessons you're going to draw for cognitivism from these arguments. So Guy kind of asked my question. I want to invite you to say just a little bit more about these thematic statements of aboutness. So they usually are really, to use another word you use a lot in a term you use quite a bit in your writing, fine-grained. So it's not just impotence or the passage of time, it's impotence as. The collusion of sort of masculinity and impotence as thus and such. Right, so they're very fine-grained interpretations of these very general thematic statements that we've discussed. We've been talking about for perhaps since today, right? So two things. You use the language, they're interesting. Right? Could you just say a little bit more about what makes them interesting? And one idea I'm toying with is. Clearly, they in their primary function, they're about the literary work and they function to organize our understanding of that. But it seems intuitive to say that they also function to organize our understanding of what the literary work, again, to use this language, is about. Those features of human experience and circumstance that they're asking us to make relevant and internal to our appreciation of the literary work. I don't think anyone wants you to is going to push you and saying that shows them truth is now going to play a role or knowledge, but just in explaining why these statements of aboutness are interesting, and sort of acknowledging that they're might create a space for you to be a little bit more generous to cognitivism, if you wish. Does that make sense? I'm restating my question so I don't repeat what Guy asked. So it's
right. I mean, I was distinguishing between two kinds of aboutness claims, if you like, or two kinds of thematic claims. One which takes a propositional form. It was rather nice because Guy and Elizabeth, in their own example, offered a proposition about Anna Karenina, and they offered just as it were, an idea which isn't a proposition, which doesn't in itself have a truth value, and it seemed to me is not something in itself that you learn. You can contemplate an idea, you can form propositions around it, but it's not obviously something that you learn. And it seemed to me that quite a few themes which are expressed through noun phrases rather than sentences, um, have a quite different function from, as it were, pointing to something real in the real world. Their function is, making the point, to Guy as well, to organize and give some sort of coherence and sense to a work. Now, I'm not sure when you talk about aboutness, and I mean, I see in one of your papers you talk about Arthur Danto's saying, Arthur Danto, I think, makes the claim that any work of art had better be about something. It's a kind of condition for being art. And I think you were sort of endorsing something like that. But that aboutness can just be a sort of conceptual aboutness. It's just about an idea, just about a concept, about a thought. So I'm not sure I'm addressing your specific worry there, John. I mean, you want these themes to have a dual role. Am I putting words in your mouth? A role within the novel and a role outside the novel, more widely applied.
That would be the idea, right? And so the question was in offering a satisfying account of how these. I don't think it's just limited to themes, but granting that these forms of aboutness that we're all interested in here, an account of why they're interesting. Especially if one accepts what you say, that they're interesting because they generate thoughts that are really interesting. To capture what makes them interesting, there's going to be some to explain what their power, why they're objects of aesthetic immersion, their force. Some we might need to acknowledge some degree to which they open up a perspective, not just on the literary work, but what the literary work is about, those features of the world that it's addressing. So there is a little bit of transference, and again, not using that to argue for some notion of truth or knowledge, but just to be able to explain how they're interesting as thoughts, as opening, as forms of aboutness, might oblige us to say that they have some extra literary use or role to play. And I'll leave it at that.
Might be just giving you, or giving one, a better grasp of a particular concept. It might be, I mean, I think this in Norman Malcolm's little memoir about Wittgenstein, he says that Wittgenstein recommended him to read, was it a Tolstoy short story, in order to learn about war, because maybe this was during the Second World War. Was that right? And so Wittgenstein's thought was, you've got a very shallow. I mean, after all, Wittgenstein had been in the First World War, and he hadn't. I don't think he'd been in combat, but he'd certainly been involved in it. So he said, "Look, read this short story by Tolstoy, and you will get a more mature, deeper grasp of what war means than the one that you appear to have, being safely tucked away in upstate New York." This is Norman Malcolm. You haven't a clue what it really means. And I can see that always struck me as quite a sort of powerful thing. And that, one could say, is learning something from a work of fiction. But what's being learned, I guess, is a concept, getting a deeper concept of war by reading the story. And maybe that is the way into a sort of cognitivism which would be quite amenable, quite congenial for me. Sort of getting a kind of conceptual clarity out of reading a work of fiction about a concept.
Okay. Thank you. That was excellent.
Yeah.
Good. Well, it's been delightful to listen to you. It's been slightly frustrating not to be chairing this session, but I just want to thank you and everybody who joined us for putting your fingers so clearly on some of the concerns that are, right at, where we're trying to think carefully about these questions and notions of instrumentality that's come up. That's something I think we have in common, that we with an anti-cognitivist like yourself, non-cognitivist like yourself, Peter, that it's important that if there's going to be a connection between aesthetic value and cognitive value, that there's not going to be a risk of aesthetic value being reduced to some kind of cognitive value, or artworks just serving a cognitive purpose in that kind of way. That was one theme or question that was raised. And I think also the questions about the definition of our terms, right? And I think it's also because you in your work have been so clear about the reasons we should be wary of cognitivism, that that there are also ways for us to think about cognitivism, be it in terms of insight, be it in terms of understanding, be it in terms of cumulative knowledge, that are possible now, and to a certain extent there might be a really kind of terminological issue here, more than a profound philosophical issue, but I also hear some points of resistance still. So I invite you, Peter, to join us for the next few seminars, and we'll see if we make a cognitivist out of you yet. But thank you for what you've given us today, and of course in all your other discussions about cognitivism and literature. So,
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for listening to this recorded seminar from the research project Aesthetic Cognitivism and the Prospects of Criticism. To find out more about the project, please go to our website www.aestheticcognitivism.com.